So we're just going to dive in. And the first thing that I am going to do is take a little poll because I want to find out what your entry point is. It was really great to see your comments in your in that opening keynote when you talked about why inquiry is important. But we also saw that there was a range of experience in inquiry. So I'm going to take a little poll here and ask what your entry point is. Are you fairly new to inquiry-based social studies teaching? Have you experienced inquiry as a learner, but maybe not as a teacher? And this is for instructional coaches too, or administrators. I know there's a lot of you out there. So are you new to this inquiry-based teaching world and wondering how you support your teachers? Do you have some experience with inquiry in your classroom? Or do you feel pretty comfortable implementing inquiry in your classroom? And maybe you're here to dig into that practice, or you're here to figure out what are you going to do to help others in your school or district experience that same level of comfortability. So when about 90% of us have voted, I'll end the poll and I'll share the results with you. And we're just about there. Okay, so I'm going to end this poll and then share the results with you. And it looks like we have a balance here. About 38% of you are fairly new to inquiry-based social studies teaching. And then a very small amount have experienced inquiry as a learner. And that is not surprising, right? I think that many of us had very traditional educations and probably didn't have an opportunity to practice inquiry. And then have some experience with inquiry in the classroom, and then a small percentage are pretty comfortable with inquiry. So we really ask that wherever you are, let's figure out a way to meet you where you are, and your questions in the chat in other interactions, bring your specific entry point into the conversation. So I'm going to stop sharing this now. I'm actually going to do one more poll. I was going to save this for later. I don't have a fancy slide for it, but I want to know, when you think about inquiry, what's the part of it that you don't get? Here's what I don't get about inquiry-based social studies. It could be other, and if there's an other, put it in the chat. I don't get how units are structured, compelling questions and all of that. Why is it important for students to learn this way? I don't get that. Seems like a lot of you are on board with inquiry. What are students actually doing in the classroom? We can hear a lot about the curriculum, but what are they doing every day in an inquiry-based social studies classroom? Is that what many of you are wondering? Or how do you write? How do you create? How do you find the resources that you need? So just take a second to do this. And once again, when we get up to 90%, I will share the results, and we'll see. This is kind of a pre-test, an evaluation here of what you're looking for out of this institute, and it'll give us some idea of how our sessions are aligned to what you're most curious about, where you're experiencing the most friction in your practice of inquiry. And we have had a time to have everyone. I'm just going to share results right now so we can get going. So about 39% of you are like, how is inquiry structured? This is great, because I'm going to talk about that specifically in this introduction. Many of you are also wondering, how do you write, create, and find resources? You'll be interested in our sessions today, later in the day, when we are giving you protocols, where we're talking about resources that'll help you. And also 26% of you are like, what are students actually doing in the classroom? What does a day of inquiry look like? And what does a week of inquiry look like? And what does a whole unit of inquiry look like? So hopefully in today's exploration, we are going to we're going to cover those, some of those questions. So in today's exploration, Shanti gave us a little bit of a history of inquiry in elementary social studies. I'm going to do a brief overview, and then we're going to get into that question that many of you had, that curiosity that many of you had. What is the structure of inquiry-based social studies? And we're going to do a little bit of back and forth and taking a look at how inquiry-based structure turns traditional models of direct instruction on their head. And then finally, we're going to briefly talk about the power of inquiry-based social studies. And many of you revealed a knowledge of that in just in your feedback to Shanti in that first. And we're going to monitor the chat, and Ashley is going to be collecting your great questions, and then at the end we can circle back and take a look at them. So a brief history of inquiry in elementary social studies. When we talk about, very, very few of us had an inquiry-based experience in social studies, specifically in elementary school, probably across, but I cannot remember my elementary social studies experience at all. But I began my career as a middle school social studies teacher, and then moved on to high school social studies. And when I would interact with elementary teachers who were in a more traditional classroom, what I saw was that most of what was happening was focused on heroes and holidays, and also the memorization and recall of information. That is the traditional social studies instructional paradigm in elementary school. And it is one of the difficulties that Shanti was talking about, is that people are coming in and criticizing social studies with an outmoded view of what social studies is about and what social studies should be. It is not memorizing facts and figures. It is not having students think like their teacher. But that was the instruction that people grew up with, and that is their frame of reference. So in the world of traditional instruction, what started to move us toward inquiry? Well, the first thing, and Shanti talked a little bit about this, the thing that moved us even far away from social studies was No Child Left Behind, the rigorous testing protocols, and the amount of time that was taken up in reading and math instruction, and the limited nature of social studies instruction. The beginning of a movement toward inquiry actually came through the Common Core, and the Common Core emerging as the creation of these college and career ready standards, which included social studies standards for ELA, prompted social studies leaders to take action, and did not want the world of the Common Core and the world of ELA to be creating the standards and the methodologies which students should learn social studies by. And really what emerged out of that impetus was what we talked about, what Shanti talked about, the C3 framework. And this is where many of you might be familiar with the C3 framework, might have heard of the C3 framework. Maybe you've gone to the IDM Institute. So the C3 framework is not a set of standards. And many of you might already know that. It contains almost no content recommendations and very few practical pedagogical strategies. And instead, it focuses on the structure of inquiry, how we learn, how we should be learning social studies, the development of social studies disciplinary skills across grade levels. Very intentionally, the C3 framework was created as a guide for states and schools to create social studies standards based on the framework. And this, the guiding principle of this is the inquiry arc. as you move through a unit of social studies, you should be examining these dimensions. The dimension, number one, developing questions and planning inquiries. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more. And then as you move through your investigation, you apply disciplinary concepts and tools from geography, from history, from civics, from economics. You evaluate sources and use evidence. And then finally, you communicate conclusions and you take informed action. The C3 framework was a giant leap forward in redefining the way that social studies instruction occurred. It is that move away from traditional direct instruction. And now, what does that mean for you as social studies teachers? What is the structure of inquiry-based social studies? When we talk about the structure, we break it down at Inquire Ed. We break it down in a little more concise way. And we talk about the inquiry process having three major steps. First, it begins with the creation of the inquiry question and the introduction in a unit of the inquiry question to students. And then it moves through a sustained investigation and it culminates in informed action. And what I want to do is take a look now at each of those steps one by one, and then really dig into some of the ways in which you can structure an inquiry. And to me, structuring an inquiry is difficult, but the structure of an inquiry is only the framework, it's only the skeleton. It's what you're doing every day in the classroom. It's what you're doing to fill in that structure that is the most challenging and the most time consuming for teachers. So, but first we have to talk about how we're structuring our inquiries. So in a traditional unit structure, let's take a look at fifth grade is on my mind right now. So you might approach a fifth grade unit and say that you introduce it to your students and say, we're going to start to study colonial America. And doing that, we're going to talk about the experiences and perceptions of different groups. We are going to talk about daily life, trade, and commerce. And then we're going to look at social structures. This would be how many of us experienced the instruction, or at least the framework of social studies instructions as learners. There was the subject matter that we were studying, and then that subject matter was broken down into manageable chunks. Maybe we read about that in a textbook, filled out some worksheets. Maybe we were lectured about it. This is still how much instruction happens in social studies across the board. Just looking at that, think about, it's important that students learn that content, but if I'm presenting it just as subject matter like that, it seems like it is already defined. There is a body of knowledge out there, and it's your job to go absorb it and recall it. There is no hook, there is no doubt, there is no ambiguity about structuring a unit this way when it's presented to a learner. But what the structure of inquiry does is it takes that and it breaks it up into, instead of chunks of information to absorb and recall, questions to explore. And it starts with what C3 calls a compelling question and what Inquire Ed in our world call an inquiry question. It is that, and we're going to get into that in a second, so I don't want to go too far. And then instead of breaking it down into manageable chunks of subject matter, it is broken down further by supporting questions. And let me take you on a little journey about how this might affect the way in which a unit is implemented in the classroom. So let's first look at an inquiry question. what makes a great inquiry question, a great compelling question? And I'm going to ask that to you right now in the chat. If you were going to hook students into a unit about colonial America, what would make a great question? What's an example of a great question? Or what qualities does a great inquiry question or compelling question have? If you can chat your responses, like what is it? What does it look like? It's open-ended. Absolutely. Open-ended. Relevant. Open-ended. So clearly, if you can turn the page and find the answer, it's not an inquiry question. Something they will, I love that. Something they will leave the room still thinking about. Is the inquiry question broader than the supporting questions? Yes. Open-ended and thought-provoking. We'll get into it a little bit. Worth spending time on and can argue about. Provokes curiosity. Allows for multiple perspectives. Ideally, it would be relevant to students' lives, open-ended, and have multiple answers. I'm going to start seeing what here. Open-ended and complex, no right answer. Absolutely. Connects to the lived experiences of students. Something that reaches out from the curriculum, from the subject matter, and says, this applies to your life right now. This applies to your experience. And that is a challenging thing to craft a question. But if you spend time and practice, it gets easier over time. I ask our learning experience team, but it still is hard. Here's something that we always strive to include in our inquiry question, that somehow it contains a call to action, meaning I am not answering this question for the question's sake itself. It's that I can take some action with the answers that I find, the solutions, the information that I collect when I am exploring this question. And I'm going to define that a little bit more. So open-ended and complex, connects to the lived experiences, contains this call to action, and all of those things that you said as well, like something that they walk out the room still talking about, something that engages their curiosity. So I want to go back to our colonial America structure and our traditional unit structure. And let's take a little poll here and see which of the following questions do you think meets the requirements that we talked about? If we were to replace the words colonial America, that's still what we're studying, that's the subject matter. But if we were going to frame this unit instead with an inquiry question, what would be one that met the requirements of open-ended and complex, engaging and sparking curiosity, contains some kind of call to action? We could do something with this, with the answer to that. Which would be the inquiry question that you think would be one of the ones that we might want to frame the unit with? And I'll give you a couple seconds to choose between those. And it's a little tricky because some of these have, some of them are engaging, some of them are spark curiosity. They all seem to be, yes, they are all open-ended. So they meet some of the requirements. We'll see if we can find one that meets all of our requirements. And in a second, I will end the poll and then share the results with you once we're at 80%. And we are close enough. We're at 82. So I'm going to share these results. How can facing the complexities of America's past help us to meet the challenges of the present? Is the majority of you chose that as meeting the requirement. And if we look at our slide deck here, in fact, that is the one, that is an inquiry question that frames one of the units that in our curriculum. And I can tell you that much debate, hours and hours and hours of debate went into choosing that question. And there were many iterations of that question. And what that does is, isn't that more of an essential question? This doesn't seem student friendly. So we're in fifth grade, and what happens is that it's not a question that is introduced lightly. It's not a question that you put on the board and don't discuss. This question is the beginning of their experience. It is introduced specifically with a hook activity to help them understand it. It is reinforced by them generating their own questions from it. And then one important thing to understand, and it is too difficult for first grade. This is a fifth grade or second grade. This is a fifth grade question. But across the board, here's something that is important to understand, is that over time, over an inquiry unit, over the 4 weeks of an inquiry unit, the 5 weeks of an inquiry unit, students are developing their understanding. And that goes across the board for everything that you're trying to do. If we expect them to know everything at the beginning of a unit, they're not going to. But over time, as they build up that knowledge, as the vocabulary becomes familiar to them, as the subject matter becomes familiar to them, as you post this inquiry question on the board and revisit it 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times in a unit, as you unpack it, then this complex question for fifth graders becomes something that they can grapple with and that they can understand. And that's what's very important to understand. Now, as we move into the essential questions or supporting questions for this, we can look at how these content chunks become, well, to understand how facing the complexities of America's past can help us to meet the challenges of the present. We can start with, what did the so-called New World represent for Indigenous people, Africans, and Europeans? And now a whole series of lessons will unpack that question. And then we'll talk about how our understanding now develops our larger understanding of the inquiry question. Instead of daily life, trade, and commerce, how did cooperation and conflict affect the survival of a community? That is an interesting, compelling question. So these smaller questions, they're open-ended and they're compelling. And what you do with these, what we call essential questions, is you link them very specifically to lessons and to content that you are exploring. And finally, for social structures, instead of we're examining social structures, how can social structures limit freedom and opportunity? And we can look at those social structures in colonial America and begin to understand how social structures at that time limited freedom and opportunity for groups of people. And what we're doing is slowly building this deep, deep knowledge and a complex knowledge of the subject matter. One of the things that there's a book that I will share later on that just came out. It's called The Extended Mind. And it talks about how our brain, the overwhelming model for our brain right now is the computer. And it is a horrible model for what our brain actually is, because a computer processes the same thing in the same way, no matter where it is, no matter if it's in one room or the other, no matter what time it is, no matter what is going on around it, it's always performing the same processes. And instead of a computer model, the author of this book talks about the model being like a magpie. A magpie collects bits of string and objects and then brings them back and weaves them in and creates something out of them. And that is the way that students are experiencing an inquiry unit across the board. They are deeply learning the subject matter in multiple ways throughout the entire unit. And their brain is making those connections as you move through. So when we talk about an inquiry unit structure, we're talking about an inquiry question broken down into essential questions. In C3 language, a compelling question broken down into supporting questions. I'm going to get a drink real quick. So that structuring a unit is a little bit of an art, a little bit of a science. But it's still just the structure. If we could stop building a house just when the framing is up, it's not going to keep us warm in the winter, and where I live in Chicago for sure. It is filling in the details that is so much of the work of the inquiry-based social studies teacher, and creating a sustained investigation into those into that inquiry question and into those essential questions. And when we talk about sustained investigation, we're talking about a teacher's role in and students' role in first collecting and analyzing sources. Sources are the lifeblood of an inquiry unit and an inquiry classroom. Teachers selecting the sources and students interrogating high quality sources. When I began my social studies teaching career, I was not an inquiry-based teacher. There were maybe 2 or 3 sources of information often in my class. I was one, and the textbook was the other. When I made a shift to an inquiry-based model, I moved to the side. And it became my role to find the primary and secondary sources, the artifacts to bring in, and then help students mediate between, help mediate students' experience between themselves and the source, ask questions of the source, draw conclusions from the source. So sources are extremely important as you're going on a sustained investigation. You've got a source, but the next job is to come up with what tasks are students using to investigate that source. Teachers design and students engage in, I say, culturally responsive and inquiry-based learning tasks in relation to those sources. And we're going to dig into this here in a second in our breakout rooms. Finally, facilitation. So designing the task, the next is teacher steps to the side, and how do I differentiate learnings using all the different modalities that I can to help students interact with this source to complete the task. So investigation across the unit is where the real work of instruction happens. What we just talked about before was design. There's design in this too, but we're starting to get into individual lesson design and then facilitation. So inquiry strategies within lessons is a place where we can really start to dig in, and we can start to say, okay, if I know you all, if you're teachers, you want practical things that you can do every day in your classroom. I found a great source. Now, have you vetted that source? Have you asked yourself all the questions you need to ask yourself about it? Well, assume that you have, and you have a great source. And you know that source is really aligned to your essential question and the objectives you want. What do I do in the classroom? How can I, in the most active way, encourage students to explore content in collaboration with their peers? And what strategies we're looking for are questioning, brainstorming, gathering and responding to evidence, discussing and sharing out. Those are the essential building blocks of an inquiry-based lesson that then build into an inquiry-based unit. And what we're going to do right now is engage with an inquiry-based strategies jigsaw. So I'm going to take you on a couple of views here. So first of all, you're going to use this inquiry-based lesson strategy sheet. It has 7 inquiry-based lesson strategies, and it has instructions here at the top for what you need to do with it. I'm going to go back to the slide deck because they're also on the slide deck. So when you go into your breakout room, each group member should explore a different strategy. So figure out a real quick way to just say, I've got 1, I've got 2, I've got 3, I've got 4. So however many in your group, each person should have 1 strategy. Connect it, ask yourself, how does it support a sustained inquiry-based investigation as you understand it right now? How is it supporting that investigation? And then, have you used a strategy like this before? Have you used this strategy before? What have been difficulties with it? What have been successes that you've had with it? And then you're going to record your ideas on a Jamboard that I'm going to share with you right now. So if you're in breakout room number 1, you're going to be, I see all the anonymous animals up here. If you're in breakout room number 1, then you're going to go to your breakout room number 1 Jamboard, and then you choose gallery walk. And then underneath gallery walk, it supports inquiry-based investigation by, I'm going to create a sticky note. Maybe I'm even going to color code it the same color as my my strategy, and I'm going to answer the question. And then if I want to do several smaller answers, short answers, I can just put them all under here. You can stack them up. And then when you're done, we'll give you a timer. We're going to let you do this for a few minutes, and then we're going to ask you to share out, introduce your strategy to other people in your group, and talk about how it supports that investigation and how it compares to other strategies that you've used. So right now, we're going to break you up. Ashley is going to magically send you into breakout rooms. Remember that find the Jamboard that corresponds to the number of breakout room you're invited to. So when Ashley does this, it'll say, Ashley's inviting you to go to breakout room number 13. So make sure that you find Jamboard number 13, and that's where you're going to do your work. So Ashley, we're looking for around, 5 or 6 people, but we've got 74 participants, 5 or 6 people per breakout room. So she's going to send you right now. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I think everybody is in now. Curious now that you are back in this main room, if you could chat a little bit about in the chat, so I know I know a little bit about what happened in there. Did anyone find a inquiry-based lesson strategy that they specifically thought that they might use in their classroom? Did anyone find we'll definitely print this resource out. Thanks for sharing. And Emmy, it's a resource that by the end of this, that we have about 15 or 20 more of those strategies. And I can even share a couple links to those resources, or you can look back and give them. Emery later on today is going to share some more. They're really those protocols that can help you facilitate instruction in an individual lesson. The note card reflection, opportunities for speaking, listening. Would love to have more of these to pass on. Yes, Manny definitely will get you more of those. And it is the how in an individual lesson. Questions that people often have about these strategies is, how do you then assess progress, and how do you how do you assess learning and understanding as students use these strategies? And that's a great question that I think will be covered in a later session. Gallery walks are great ways. We wish we had more time to share, but I was excited to learn more about Socratic seminar. That's great to know that, this was our first breakout session. And so it's good to know that you could have used a little more time. That's important for us to understand too, as we move forward. If you have reflections about specific things you'd like to share with the panelists, like, hey, that breakout session could have been a little bit longer, that'll help us going forward. Fortunately, we didn't maybe need the Jamboard, and I'm really glad that we figured out that it wasn't working because we have other people that were planning on using it. I want to move on really quickly and talk about this final step of the inquiry process, informed action. And many of you maybe wonder about informed action, and I can tell you that we're going to have a whole session about it. But when we think about informed action, we think about it developing out of the inquiry and connecting to students' interests and experiences. So it is not a project that is separate from the learning that happened in your classroom. It is directly related to the content knowledge and the skills that students have been building across an inquiry. But the purpose isn't for them to just demonstrate their learning. The purpose is more than a grade. There's an audience out there that we need to inform about this, to persuade, to change their opinion, to inspire them to take action. And it is shared with a public audience outside the classroom. Now, before you say, I don't have the time to do that, or that's the resources, it could be it could be a buddy class down the hall. It can be to the principal and the librarian who are coming together because the project has to do with something with the library. And I'll give you an example of one of those. So, or it could be to the PTO, it could be to the school board, it could be to a number of different entities. You could think about how much time and effort that you want to put into finding that audience. But just know you can structure it to meet your needs and meet what's available to you. Let's think about that. How can facing the complexities of America past help us to meet the challenges of the present? Imagine a whole unit of learning about that specific time period in unpacking this question. Here's some suggestions. So students inspire community members, so there's my audience, to consider how the complexity of the nation's past is evident in the present. They create a newspaper that analyzes current events and their relationship to colonial era ideas, events, and interactions. Maybe they present that newspaper. Maybe you work with the local library to have that newspaper be something that's featured on a bulletin board there. There are a number of different ways to share that, but it is also, if you notice, hitting that maybe an ELA requirement. But it is based in their experience. It gives them a sense, Tara, of purpose and ownership. Here's a presentation product. Students address the misrepresentation of cultural groups through a presentation to the school community about colonial era artworks. So within the unit, you're examining sources, primary and secondary sources, and some of those primary sources are depicting groups at that time and misrepresenting them. And here's a presentation, maybe it's a slide presentation about those misrepresentations. They put captions on them. They make annotations. They create factual call-outs to make their case and present facts related to historical events depicted. Another possibility that people have chosen in this in this area is a school that didn't have a land acknowledgement, and to understand that creating one of those is a complicated process, but it's dealing with the complexity of the past and a problem that, or an opportunity to face that in the present. And in another unit, students were researching in their unit, and they found many of the books that they encountered on the lower shelves in their library were out of date, 20, 30 years old, and had misrepresentations in them. So they chose to do a presentation to their librarian and to their principal about recommending that those books be updated. Tammy says, we have found out in our polarized state, informed action can be a trigger word for some groups. Yes. Before I even read the rest of it, absolutely. Action civics. They're practicing action civics. We have stopped using the word in certain areas and call it real life connections, connecting to today, or community connections, just trying to do the great extension. That's absolutely, Tammy, that's a really great, some communities, if you use that word action, what they will think is not that you're doing a presentation or creating a community garden or, creating a newspaper. They will say they're taking action. They're making one thing I read, they're making their kids go to protests. Things like that. So it's really important to think about informed action. If informed action and the word action is somehow a trigger word in your community, then use a different word. Absolutely. Because what's happening is someone is misusing that word, twisting it, and it's hurting your cause as a social studies teacher. I do like real life connections. So that's a really great consideration, Tammy, and thank you for bringing that up. And maybe when you get to Jeanette's session, I think maybe Jeanette's listening, she's going to do the informed action section. There can be a broader discussion of that in this hyper-partisan situation we're in. Do we need to reframe this? It is absolutely important, and we all know it, that students do something with their learning. And how we shape that, how we call that, how we brand that is really important. So just to wrap up here, you said this in your chats to Shanti, but in inquiry-based social studies, what do students experience? Deep, active engagement in investigations of social studies content. Big misnomer, big misconception about inquiry is it's fluff, that it's not rigorous. Inquiry is rigorous. It is deep, active engagement in social studies content knowledge building. That students also experience culturally responsive instruction. You will have the benefit of a session today. You will see Shanti again, and she will come back and talk about culturally responsive instruction in social studies. So students experience in inquiry-based social studies, culturally responsive instruction. And here it is. Here's some of the things we've talked about too, is that they will experience productive struggle to discern, meeting, and address real world problems. And that can be challenging for students, and then challenging for you as teachers to find that level of productive struggle, so that when they are arriving at a realization, over the course of a unit, they are building that deep knowledge, not because it's easy, but because it is right at that stretch zone where you want them to be. And then because they're solving a real world problem, it really allows them to say, this is really important and I'm going to dig into this. What happens when students experience that? Students become resilient learners who can adapt to changing circumstances. And that is what we need. That is what they need to be active members of their community. That is what they need in their future in school and career. They also become engaged, informed, and socially responsible members of their communities. I hope that Sam Weinberg tomorrow will reinforce what he's said many times before, is that social studies teachers are really on the front lines of our democracy. And inquiry-based social studies is the way that we give life to our democracy and support it. So it is absolutely so important that we are talking and showing our students that it is a process, that being a informed citizen, an informed participant in your community is a process. And that process is an inquiry-based process. And finally, critical consumers of information, goods, and services, as they move through an inquiry-based instruction, they're learning to ask questions, they're learning to weigh evidence, and they're learning to make informed choices. So I feel like we're at our time here, and I want to give you enough time to sort of decompress, get some lunch, come back ready to dig into Emery's session. It's not an either or, student questions and content standards. And I think it's going to be a really great and practical session for you as you begin to think about how inquiry-based learning, and it's back to a question we had earlier, how you balance that tension between following student voice and choice and students' interest and meeting your content standards. We'll have some time for some questions at the end of the day, but thanks everyone. I hope this has been a really great introduction, and all of my colleagues that follow me are going to dig deep into many of these subjects.